There is a little fun fact about the next speaker, which connects him to the previous speaker. So Chris Hartjes, the ultimate authority on PHP testing, he's basically the testing police. He actually rejected the first talks of Gary Hawkins when he was organizing True North Conference in Canada. Yep. So yeah, everything comes together. So today, Chris is going to explore what's beyond testing. So what can we do, given that we always do testing, of course, right?
No, so we don't actually.
So otherwise, he comes to your house. Yeah. So yeah, let's see what comes next. Please welcome Chris Hartjes.
Thank you very much. If you notice, I'm kind of like Gary, but I'm like 1.5 times his size. So, yes, as people may know, I wasn't originally on the list to speak. I was just going to be an attendee. I got peer pressured by the people who I work with at Rove to just come hang out in Italy at this event. And then when we had an unfortunate cancellation, I was asked if I could talk. And since I've been speaking at conferences since, it's a long time, 2005 was when I first did one. So of course, at any time I have like 100 different presentations on my laptop. So I agreed to speak. So this talk is entitled, Your Tests Won't Save You. And this is where I sort of, much like Gary's talk, this is full of my own opinions, and you may disagree with some of them, but given that I'm a lot taller than Gary, I think people are going to be way less likely to want to punch me in the face, and they probably can't reach that high either. And so I'm going to apologize and say sorry in advance for my thick Canadian accent and how fast I speak. Yes, I mean, who else had longer than 9 hours to travel here? All right, just a couple, yeah. So I got on a plane in Toronto and flew from Toronto to Charles de Gaulle, which I think is the largest airport I've ever been in, and waited in a huge immigration line, and then had to wait 7.5 hours at the airport as a layover before I flew to Venice, where one of my Rove teammates came and picked me up. So it was a pretty long trip. So a little egocentric interlude for those who may not be familiar with my work, which will actually hurt my feelings because you all should know who I am. I've been, as Alessandro mentioned, I've been the police officer in the PHP community talking about testing. I've been talking about testing stuff since I basically started doing talks. I discovered unit testing very, very early in my career when I worked on an adult dating website, otherwise known as for traveling salesmen to cheat on their wives. I'm not proud of that time early in my programming career, but it paid the bills and it taught me a lot about office politics. And we had a really failed launch of the main product, and they fired a bunch of people, and I got dragged into the project manager's office where they were ready to fire me too if I started arguing about the other people who got fired. But instead he handed me a book, which was a very early edition of Kent Beck's Extreme Programming by Example. It's like this red covered book, and it had a section on unit testing. And for me, that was like, you know, the light bulb moment where I was like, wow, like we could have found a way to make sure the users didn't discover the problems before we did. And then I got into testing, and that led to basically my entire career up until this point is all from a project manager scared that I was going to yell at him and quit. So that's pretty good. So this talk, unlike Gary's, which showed some examples of his lazy programming style, this contains no code or no tests. This is about opinions and tools. And so this talk is probably aimed at if you're working on a project where you probably have more than 2 contributors to it. While I feel like testing is important, and you probably should also get into the habit of using various testing tools on your projects when it's even just a solo one that you're doing. But for the most part, all the complementary tools are really about how to better manage things when you have 2 or more people working on a project. So, for the longest time, I was literally the only person giving talks at PHP conferences about testing. And, there was, these days it's a little bit easier because pretty much every high-profile open source project has tests with it, not just in the PHP world, but other programming languages. I don't do just PHP. I'm going to name drop some stuff. I spent a couple years working for a little teeny tiny internet-based company that you may have heard of called Mozilla, the Firefox. And I worked on the Firefox project, writing a bunch of tests for various services, so I got exposed to using Python and Perl in some cases. So there's automated tests everywhere. So there had always been attempts to like quantify what are the values of the tests. Are we just doing these to like make ourselves feel better or make ourselves feel superior to people that we don't like? But a long time ago, IBM and Microsoft did a study where they took a bunch of teams and gave them all the same problem to solve. And they said, we want these teams to use test-driven development, and being very strict about that definition, we are writing the tests before we write all the code. And the other teams can do whatever they want. And then we're going to measure how long it took for the various teams to deliver the final product, and also what were the bug rates like. So when they did the study, at the end of it, they discovered that the teams that used test-driven development, it took them longer to deliver, which makes sense because the tests are code, so it's extra code that we are writing on top of all the code we have to write. So it took them 20 to 40% longer to deliver on the project. Again, intuitively, that makes sense. But they noticed that the teams that used test-driven development ended up with 40 to 90% fewer bugs ending up, or bugs that the users found, I should say, because there's always bugs in everything. So 40 to 90%. So if you're like me, and you want to lie for profit, you just try to convince your boss by saying, hey, for one extra day a week, we'll have 90% fewer bugs. So that's what I tell people to tell their bosses about why to use tests. But tests only fix a very small part of the problem. I've been getting paid to write PHP code since 1998, and I've discovered that the issue isn't PHP. It's never really PHP. The issue is always people. So what I'm talking about is tools that help us better manage the people part of the problem. Because again, tests don't help with people problems. So I want to emphasize that this idea that we can just be isolated at home these days, or sitting in your cubicle at work, cranking out something beautiful, and then you hand it off to somebody else, and that it's perfect and ready to go, that's a myth. The lone developer creating something brilliant is a myth. You are going to interact with people. If you got into programming because you thought you would never have to talk to a human again, you were wrong, right? So like having tests is sort of like, it used to be like the last step that I told people they need to worry about, but these days I believe it's the first step. You need tests because you're trying to prove over and over again in a repeatable fashion that your application is behaving the way that you expect. But just having tests alone, it will not save you from poor quality and uneven outcomes. Poor quality in your code, poor quality in your practices, and you want the ultimate outcome of, I want to get my code, I want to have code that's correct and behaving as expected, make its way as quickly as possible from my local development environment up into production where our users want to use them. A truth that I want everyone to like understand is that unless you are building tools for other programmers, am I allowed to swear, by the way? Because I do swear quite a bit, probably not. No one cares what tech stack you're using. They don't care what framework, they don't care what CSS tools you're using, they don't care what JavaScript framework you're using, they don't care about your bundler, they don't care about your cool build server, they don't care about any of that. The user cares whether this application solves their problem. So, I mean, I know that as programmers, a lot of us gravitate towards the new and shiny. Gary's talk about having a small set of tools that you understand really, really well. I think having that sort of attitude about, I'm going to pick something and master it, will help you deliver solutions a lot quicker. It's very easy to get distracted by new tools. So let's try and address the people problems that we can have with some technology, right? So again, technology is not the answer to people problems. It's very tempting to think that if only I use this framework or this tool or this new task management system or anything technology-based, it's tempting to think that technology will solve it. We all see how great social media is. Technology is not the answer to the problems that we face in communicating. Automated systems are great at doing what we tell them to do over and over again. Whether they do what we want them to do is always a different story. But by adding some tools to help solve the people problems that we face when we've committed to the idea of we want to be test-centric. And by test-centric, I mean that tests are like a first-class part of the development process. Tests aren't something that we're throwing in afterwards. Tests aren't something that we do when we have time. It's that we don't do anything without figuring out how can someone else prove that what I'm doing behaves as expected. Now, we can run all the way from super complicated test suites to just having a checklist that you give to somebody and say, here, check out the code, start up the server, and go through this checklist that I wrote one by one. That's just as valuable a test in many cases than having some crazy test suite with 100% coverage of everything. So what are some things that I, in my experience, having worked on so many different projects in so many different states of success or failure, what do I think really helps at this point? So what I think is, ironically, I want to focus on tools that save us from thinking. And not just thinking, but like remembering. We saw how Gary likes to use make files. So he's like, I have one command that I type to do my static analysis, one command to start up. I want to not have to remember what command do I need to do to start things up? Because I'm old. I'm 51, which is like 1,000 years old when you do stuff online for a living. So I have all sorts of other esoteric things shoved in my brain, like when is my pool opening, and when do I need to go get groceries, and is checking my Twitter feed 20 times a day a sign that I have an addiction? Like those are things that I want to spend. I want to spend energy on that, and not worry about syntax for things. So I'm always looking for tools that once I figure out what it is I need to do to solve a particular task, get the laptop to do it for me over and over again. Because the laptop's going to hopefully without complaining. And like I said, the remembering part. But more importantly, we want tools that can save us from ourselves. Everyone has bad habits they build up over time. And by making the responsibility for applying changes or remembering how to do things, make a program do it, then I'm not tempted to, I'm just going to do it a little bit differently this time. It's like, no, I'm going to trust that the tool is going to make the changes or do the analysis that I want to do. So what are 3 tools that I think can help us, right? I really like build tools. I really like code stylers and sniffers, and I think empathy is actually a very underrated, non-technical is not the right word, but a personal skill, that understanding that everyone is not like me, while incredibly shocking, does go a long way towards figuring out how do I build tools that other people can use, and how can I understand how to use other people's stuff. Because when you get to being like a senior level consultant type thing, because I happen to work with the Row folks. They very generously allowed me to come back and work for them when my latest stint was over. And you come to realize that you're faced with a legacy application that works and makes money for the client, and our job is to make sure that it continues to make money for that client, while also fixing all the things that irritate us about it, integrate new things. And the only way that actually works, despite our grumbling about both team members and people who work for our client, empathy is actually key. By trying to understand, why are they making this decision that irritates me so? Why are they still stuck on a version of PHP that doesn't get security updates? Why do they do the things that they do? Empathy at least lets you get closer to the heart of why. Maybe you can't change their minds, but at least you can understand why they're doing things. So why do I like build tools? I like them because they spare me from remembering error-prone sequences. I like to get computers to do things for me because they can. Once I tell it how to do it, it will do it for me. I write a shell script. I use Composer. I use something built in Python. PyTest is quite good for that sort of stuff. It can do it over and over again. As humans, we're prone to making mistakes when we're typing, and even worse, we tend to sometimes inadvertently miss steps. I'm sure almost everyone here has had the experience of, in order to get the code out of my development environment and up into production, there's like 10 different things I need to type from the command line. I may need to run my tests and then use some sort of asset bundling tool, and then I have to push something to my version control system, and then I have to tell it to do something else and do this other thing and do this other thing. And inevitably, when there's so many steps, at some point, you're tired, you're lacking focus, you just want this thing to get done, you miss a step, and everything blows up. and then I will get onto chat, and usually I say to James, I know there's this thing that had like 7 steps. I think I missed one, and everything is completely horribly broken. And then James mutes and probably swears about what I've done, and then unmutes, and he helps me fix the problem. But the trick should be when you have something that's multiple steps, get the build tool to do it for you. So, what can be build tools? Well, we can have a series of handcrafted shell scripts, which is the way a lot of people start doing things, especially if they're used to switching between languages on a project. Or we could use a language-specific tool. Composer is great for that as well. Add stuff to your Composer JSON, and there you go. You can Composer whatever. And then build servers themselves. Now, I remember way back when the world was still black and white, and internet was through a 14.4K modem. I remember playing around with Hudson, which became Jenkins, which is sort of like the ancestor of the modern build systems that we use now that GitHub and GitLab and other providers give us for free. For me, it was fascinating that we could then take all the work that we were doing locally and get some other system to do it. And hopefully, if we had done a good job, we could just literally transfer everything over to it. And again, have another system worry about what order do these things need to execute in, and what we're supposed to do if things go wrong, because things always go wrong. It's never smooth. So again, a build tool's job is to pretend to be a human doing something flawlessly. That's its job. That's why we spend all the time to try and figure out what are all the steps that we need to deploy our application to production, get the computer to do it, and then we don't have to worry about making mistakes. Like I said, they're computers. They're great at doing what we tell them over and over again. Just the problem is oftentimes we've told the computer to do the wrong thing. And the computer usually does it without complaining. Because humans, as I said, we make all kinds of mistakes. So again, a lot of what I do is trying to free up mental energy, because we only have so much attention we can give every day to work. Some days I have a half hour's worth of attention that I can give to something, and other days I feel like I have unlimited energy. And so I want the tools to do what I would call repetitive tasks, so that I don't have to remember them, and I can then concentrate on solving problems like how do I add a step to an acceptance test suite, and where do I find in the code where we're creating a fixture where we pretend to be a credit card processor, and things that are like actual problems that aren't 8 or 9 steps removed from what we're doing in production, but like actually right up against it. And so also your build tools can run your tests for you. Now, I know not everyone has the perfect test suite, and I know that the percentage of people these days who use tests, I'm not going to shame you into putting your hands up if you don't write tests. I get it. Like I said, I get paid whether you write tests or not, so I'm okay. You do whatever you want. But the build tools can also run these tests for you. So again, it's like another part of the process where you get your build tools to run the test for you as well, and then you just have to get into the habit of using the build tool. You don't have to remember I have 17 steps that I have to do before I go up into production. Get the build tool to do it for you, and then hopefully the build tool can tell you when things go wrong. So under what circumstances will the build tool execute for us? When do we want it to? Well, usually a good thing to do is triggered by your version control system. I'm assuming everybody here has at least been exposed to something like Git. Does anyone here remember using version control before Git came around? Well, I'm actually old enough to remember doing CVS as a version control system. I remember how terrible branching was in Subversion, and then I do remember when back then the internet's #1 troll, Linus Torvalds, when he came up with his own version control system, so he continued to be the dictator of the Linux kernel source tree. So yes, I do remember back when, well, I would say back when version control was harder, but I still have lots of problems with version control, as James knows from my constantly saying. I don't understand why I did merge and rebase and why everything is broken. So I outsource my version control management to other people. So what should your build tool do? In an ideal way, it's triggered by your version control system. But I think it's important to think of it on a higher level. You want to be triggered anytime you want to merge other work into what you're doing. So what it should be doing is getting a copy of your code, including changes, builds an environment to run your testing, and this is very important. If you're very lucky, you'll have your local development environment. You'll have some sort of like staging environment that's close to production. And then there's a whole bunch of overhead that you need to think about how do I keep the staging environment up to date with data and having it as close to production as we can get. Because again, there are types of errors that only occur in production and only occur in staging and only occur in development. We want to try to get rid of all those by having the environment, that middle environment, as close to production as possible. So, if you're using something like GitHub Actions, it'll create an environment that you can run your test in. And you run your tests, runs the tests, lets you know what passed or failed. Hopefully everything passed. If stuff failed, then you go back to that loop of change, commit, push, wait an hour for the build control system to find a slot to build your images and do everything. So that's when I try to get I try to fulfill my Twitter addiction when I'm waiting for a build to run. And then you just get in that loop of tiny change, commit, push, wait for the test to run. So build tools help you save you from yourself, because nobody is as smart as you and nobody is as dumb as you at the same time. So again, I'm encouraging people, if you find yourself doing a task over and over again manually, it's probably worth spending the time to find, is there a way I can automate this? Can I automate this from the shell? Can I automate this in my IDE? Can I get another online system to do this work for me? Again, try and save the mental energy for either your life outside of work, or to save your mental energy to actually solve difficult problems. Because not every problem needs the same amount of attention. If everything is always high level, then nothing is a high level. You want to be able to concentrate on solving the really difficult problems, not ones like remembering what mistake did I make in this series of 6 commands. Okay? And by focusing on build tools, and in other words, automated systems that run in response to a change, you get yourself towards the holy grail of continuous deployment. And when I talk about continuous deployment, what I mean is we have systems set in place so that I can get code in a completely automated fashion to go from my laptop up into production. And there's usually a bunch of things that need to happen. You need to have a really good test suite that gives you a high level of confidence that your application continues to behave the way that you expect. And I want to be clear that testing's gotten a bad rap in that department. We're really we're trying to test behavior. Not that the code is correct, because there are often many ways to get to the same solution when it comes to code, especially in a language like PHP that allows us to do all sorts of crazy stuff. In PHP, there's not one true way to do things like in many other languages. We're talking about behavior. We want to know that the application is behaving the way that we expect. So in a perfect world, I make changes, I push it, and without any intervention from me, it ends up in production for the users to experience. That's not always the case. A lot of places, the deployment part to production is separate from the development process, but that is the holy where you want to get. Okay, so we've talked about we want to have build tools, things that automatically do stuff for us. The next thing I think you should really invest time are code stylers and sniffers. And because code reviews can often descend into critiques of style over substance. A lot of developers have problems with code reviews because they interpret criticism of the code as criticism of the person. You have to learn to separate that. Because if you have good coworkers, they'll tell you if they don't like you. That you won't have to find out via code review, right? You're more concerned about making sure is the code I've written solving the problem that I've been asked to solve. That's like the number one thing that we're looking for in a code review. But then what you want to do is that you want to eliminate all the arguments over what did we name variables, where are our brackets, where are our braces, what are our indent stops, all the wonderful things that you can tweak in your ID of choice, right? We don't want that to be a discussion at all. I should not be able to look at a piece of code and be able to tell which one of my coworkers wrote it because they happen to have an idiosyncratic style of coding. We don't want that. So we don't want to have arguments over how the code should look. So that's why we use them. The one I am most familiar with is PHP Code Sniffer. And these are some of the things that we can, enforce rules in our code base about. We can talk about, we want to use the quote-unquote new array syntax instead of having array in the front. Line spacing before or after. Like, what do we want things to look like for our while loops or our if statements? You can do sniffs where you can actually check if you have a convention for where you locate your tests in your application and a convention for how you name your tests. You can have PHP Code Sniffer look around and say, hey, I don't see a test for this stuff. You can check to make sure, am I using return types if you happen to be using a version of PHP that supports it. So again, these are all things that we're saving mental energy. The idea should be you just write all your code, and then the tool will tell you if you're doing things that the rest of you have agreed that either we want to see or, more importantly, don't want to see. And PHP Code Sniffer has all sorts of others, like 50-plus things to it. Like I said, PHP Code Sniffer is the one I'm most familiar with. There are many other tools. I highly recommend that you pick a linting and styling tool and learn it really well, and then investigate the more advanced features to find out how can I do things like what Chris mentioned about how we can look for existence of tests and things like that. You'll be surprised at how effective a tool like that can be for your code base. Because we want consistent enforcement of the style rules. We don't want one person deciding that they don't like how your code looks, and then they submit a pull request that is literally just a reformatting of thing. I mean, that's a common tactic people use for what is it, Hacktoberfest, where you can get a T-shirt for making a completely minor modification to someone's legacy application. Yeah, code style things make that so that's not a thing. And we want code that all looks the same, because it makes reading it easier. One of the bigger challenges you have when you join a project is being able to look at the code and understanding what's going on. If you become familiar with the rules of what language constructs do we use, what language constructs do we not use, what do we name variables? Are we into God objects that do 100 things, or do we want to break things always down into smaller ones? That by having consistent styling, you should be able to understand quicker what's going on in the code. And again, we love to argue about everything. So again, I want to eliminate the arguments about what code looks like. I mean, we should be arguing other things than that. There's so many other things worth arguing about. That's not one of them. And I also think that when you whatever linting and styling tool that you do choose to use, that when it finds a problem, that should be considered a failed build. And you should fix those problems before it gets pushed into production. Because it's very tempting when we're on a tight deadline and we have a fix that needs to go up in production, we can be very tempted to skip these steps. I think taking the hit and deciding that even a style violation is a failed build will go a long way towards building better habits on the code base. Okay, and other languages are starting to provide automated formatters and sniffers. One of the first ones I saw outside of PHP was Golang's the Go format command. It comes with the language. So right from the beginning, the Go community said, this is the tool that we're going to use, that we're going to apply to our code, and it modifies it in place. So again, everyone's code looks the same. You don't want, I mean, it may be a minority opinion, but I really don't like the idea of I can tell who wrote a piece of code by looking at it, right? I did a lot of work with Python. The Python community went as far to have these things called PEPs, which were similar to the old Phil Sturgeon rules for people who are familiar from that back in the day, PSR. Yeah, shout out to Phil. We miss him in the community. They have tools that will do the same sort of thing. We'll analyze your code for styling and linting and other things to make sure it all looks the same. Ruby has one called Rubocop, and I'm sure other languages are doing the same sort of thing. But again, it's the idea that it gets your code, make all the changes in place, and that way everyone's code looks the same. Okay? Again, high-level thing, take advantage of these tools to eliminate remembering what the code should look like. Get another tool to do it. Worrying about what the code looks like should be way down on your list of things to worry about as a developer. Okay? And then the tougher one, empathy, right? This is the most difficult tool, I think, of all to implement because many developers believe that we should all be for those who are into sci-fi stuff, we should all be Vulcans, and we should be doing everything based on logic, and that our feelings have no place in programming. We've definitely seen in the last probably 10 years what has happened to technology when empathy and ethics are pushed to the side, and we build systems designed to to literally exploit people, right? If developers, thought about what they're doing a little bit more and trying to understand that, again, that's the key thing, understanding that not everyone is like you, I think we would be in a much better place, a much healthier place, right? Because again, like I said earlier, if you got into programming because you're like, I love working with my computer and I would love to get paid to spend hours and hours working on my computer and that I wouldn't have to deal with people, yeah, you're going to be really disappointed. Especially like, the pandemic revealed that surprisingly the state of our remote tools was probably a lot better than people had assumed. I've been working from home for 16 years now. My youngest daughter is 17, and her only memory is me working at home. And I would dump her off at daycare because there was no way I was going to be able to work and help look after her. So she only remembers me working from home. And these days the state of tooling is so much better. We have remote collaboration tools. We have Zoom. We have GoToMeeting. We discovered quite quickly that the tools were there, and the pandemic just allowed people to quickly refine them. So you will have to talk to other people. Mozilla, when I worked there, almost the entire workforce is distributed, so we had no choice. We had to learn how to work remotely. If you couldn't handle working on your own without some type of supervisor or coworker micromanaging your work, then yeah, you're going to be terrible at remote work. I think most developers, they want to do their work and not be hassled, unless they like to hassle other people. But for the most part, you're going to have to focus on talking to people and understanding how to, I was asked online the other day, what did I feel was a skill that a lot of at senior level developers are missing that they need to work on? I'm like, you need to learn how to take what, I know this is not a popular thing, but what the business people want and translate that into code or interfaces that then can be maintained and extended. That's the key thing. You have to learn how to translate business speak into code, because if you can't continue to allow your client to make money, well, they're eventually going to let you go or stop paying your invoices in some cases. So it's very important to think my job is to turn pixels into money for my client, right? So, programming-related discussions, they can turn toxic very easily. In the PHP community, we have our share of toxic topics, frameworks especially. Editors are another one where people will show their tribal affiliations. It's not as cool as tattoos to say, I have 2 tattoos because I like Viking stuff. So I have Thor's hammer and Odin's raven, which is, okay, I'm a nerd. It's kind of cool. I have a tattoo, reflect what I like. But, tribalism is very easy to fall into. It's very easy to believe that you are a better programmer than somebody else because of your choice of tools, or you start to feel inadequate because everyone wants to use framework X. Why don't I want to use framework X? Or why aren't I using framework X? Those discussions, they can turn toxic very easy. Just like every discussion online, every single topic. So again, I think your best weapon against toxicity in conversations, not only with other programmers, but with management and the general public who doesn't understand the work that you're doing, or more importantly, doesn't care. They just care that, are you making something for me that will solve my problem? Empathy is the thing you want to work on. Understanding other people's point of view and understanding why they want things done in a specific way. It's okay to disagree with other people. What's not okay is to insult them and think they're stupid for wanting things a certain way. So again, a high-level thing, you really have to internalize that not everyone thinks like you, and expecting everyone to have the same reactions as yourself to a problem or situation leads to lots of unhappiness, both in your work and in your private life as well. So, and understanding, getting into the habit of trying to understand what people want will also help you manage their, anticipate what it is that they're going to want. If you know people don't care about your choice of framework, then you can spend less time worrying about what framework I've actually chosen and just pick one that you know really well that allows you to crank out the application and crank out the business logic and just provide a solution for people. I mean, when you work on a legacy application, and legacy is something you wrote yesterday at this point, you want to be able to quickly understand how the thing works, and then how do I extend it to solve a new problem? How do I go back and refactor it to fix an older problem? And by understanding the reasons why people do things in the context of the problem you're trying to solve, just means that you're going to be way less stressed about coming up with a solution. So, and there's also, as part of the empathy, learning how to test your code requires you to actually change how you write your code. You learn very quickly when you get into the habit of kind of approaching things from a test-first perspective. You realize, what testable code starts to look like. We're generally looking for code that's solving one problem. We're looking for code with as few dependencies as possible. We start looking to make sure that we have code where we can pass those dependencies in at runtime. Because, in terms of like trying to set up a test, service locators and globally available objects are really difficult to work with because they could be overridden by something else, somewhere else in the chain. So, you start realizing what does testable code look like, and then it becomes easier to explain to people what does testable code look like. I mean, learning how to, not to old man it, but when I first learned about testing, I had to do it both ways uphill in the snow in the middle of summer in Canada. It was very hard to find other programmers who knew anything about testing, and then you had to find people who knew something about testing who were willing to take the time to explain to you what does testable code look like. Most people at this point have heard of the idea of design patterns. People have heard of design patterns. You're probably using a lot of them without realizing it because they've become so standardized. But you learn about common patterns for testing. What does testable code look like? It looks a certain way. When you see a code base, when you've been given enough exposure to writing testable code, you'll recognize immediately, I can test that, and I can test that, but I have to make some changes, or this thing is not testable, and can we get rid of it so we can have something that we can test, right? So, and again, when we talk about, on the empathy thing, learning how to, you have to change how you write your code in order to test it. For the most part, a lot of people do not like being told, I don't like the way that you write code, or you need to change how you're writing your code so it can be testable. This gets back to what I talked about earlier about code reviews, where people take the code review as a personal attack. People don't like being told they have to change. So I've noticed, especially with programmers, people like to change what they use, hence our fascination with new tools, new editors, new frameworks, newer versions of language. We love changing what we use, but we inevitably fall back to the programmer equivalent of muscle memory. We use new tools, but use them the old way, right? The way that we're used to. And more importantly, even if it's wrong, there's often a comfort level where we keep repeating suboptimal behaviors because they're familiar and comfortable, not because they're actually solving a problem. So much of the empathy part of programming is understanding that not only will we have to adopt new tools, because new solutions come up that solve problems in a better way than we were before. We have to change not only what we're using, but how we use it as well. And again, the toxicity thing, where people get very angry when you start telling them, I can't test this code. Here's how you should change it to make it testable. People don't like being told that. I'm sure I'm like that in many, many cases, but I try to understand the end goal for me is testability. I want the stuff that I write to be handed off to somebody else and for them to be able to duplicate the same behavior and to be able to test it. And if they can't do that, then I've probably failed at that particular task. And toxicity in this sort of environment drives away talented people who like working with others. I'm generally a very extroverted person in the work environment. I love talking to my coworkers. I love learning new things. I don't like being isolated and solving problems, doing nothing but solving problems on my own. Collaboration is how I learn how to do new things, how I find out how other people solve problems, and then I can apply the empathy stuff to it to say, I've been doing this all wrong. Now there is clearly a better way to solve this problem. So toxicity in a workplace, toxicity in an open source community, toxicity on a project drives away talented people who want to work with you, but your attitude sucks. So they're going to go devote whatever time they're spending outside of their day job, or not the day job, but what they're getting paid to do. They're going to spend that on something else. You want to be working with talented people. You don't want to tolerate You don't want to tolerate difficult people because they happen to be skilled. Those difficult people can go find other difficult people to work with, and then maybe they'll develop a little bit of empathy themselves. Unlikely, if they're an asshole at this point in their career, they're probably not going to change much. And so again, for almost anything beyond a solo project, both the medium term success and the long-term success of any project depends on your ability to work with others. You will come up with a situation that you cannot fix yourself because either you don't know how to fix a problem, or there's so much work involved that one person cannot get it done in that time frame. If you don't have empathy and you don't know how to communicate with people in a non-aggressive way, it just won't work. Everyone who has done any sort of open source work knows about the aggressive comments and issues placed and the entitlement that many, many people feel towards the builders of things. When are you going to fix this thing? Is this project still active? This bug, I submitted a bug ages ago, right? And it burns people out. And when they get burned out in their work outside of what they're getting paid for, their paid work will suffer as well. How much time I got? Am I already over? Wow. See? My wife, when I told her I was going to speak, they said I could talk about anything for an hour. So she was right. So I think I don't have too much more. Oh, we're almost at the end. So I will summarize. Your testing framework, having tests won't save you because it's not enough to make sure the application doesn't do the equivalent of rotting over time, right? You want to use build tools to protect you from performing complicated things manually. You want to use sniffers and stylers to make sure so you get rid of all the arguments about how your code's supposed to look. And empathy protects your project from becoming toxic. So some shameless plugs. I work for Rove. I have an elephant to give away. So I think the first person who corners me for a selfie once I get off the stage, please, can get this lovely elephant that Gary forgot to give away. You can find the best place to actually find me and interact with me is on Twitter, where I do performance art as Grumpy Programmer. And I do, in addition to doing my day work, I've written at this point 9 or 10 small pamphlets. My wife calls them pamphlets. My wife is my biggest hater when it comes to my tech work, which is refreshing. I have a bunch of self-published books about testing that are available at grumpy-learning.com. So I guess now we've got time for questions, or did I run into the time?
No, not really. We are running a little bit late. So if you want to ask questions to Chris, please get a hold of him in the hallway track.
Yeah, I'm gonna be here until the bitter end tomorrow. So all good. All right, thanks for all your attention.